don't understand why it is that the thought that the president gets to control everything can outweigh Congress's clear authority and duty to protect the people in this way.
But Justice Kavanaugh asked what happens when a president can't effectively carry out his or her agenda because of what a previous administration from an opposing party has done in maybe setting up one of these multi-member agencies or boards, and those members can't be fired by the president.
I want to give you a chance to deal with the hard hypothetical. When both houses of Congress and president are controlled by the same party, them creating a lot of these independent agencies with or extending some of the current independent agencies into these kinds of situations so as to thwart future presidents of the opposite party.
So to rule for the president, they'd have to overturn a 90-year-old precedent, which is basically been on life support, if we're being honest. But the court's going to consider some of these same questions again. Slightly different framework in January when it wades into whether the president can dismiss a Fed governor. The court has indicated that it sees the Fed as a unique institution because it is quasi-private.
I don't even feel like I'm being dramatic when I say that the Republicans on the Supreme Court genuinely think that Donald Trump should have the powers of a king. Because, like, what do you mean that y'all are about to overturn a 1935 ruling that prevented the president from firing commissioners of independent agencies for political reasons? Let me get you up to speed in case you already don't know about this. A lot of this is stemming from the case of Rebecca Slaughter, who was an FTC commissioner until Donald Trump got rid of her for no reason. And if you're wondering why he got rid of her because she was the last Democrat on the Federal Trade Commission, and he also got rid of the other Democrat who was on the Federal Trade Commission, even though traditionally there are supposed to be both Republicans and Democrats on this independent agency. As Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor stated, the Trump administration is basically asking them to destroy the existing structure of the government. Because the whole point of these independent agencies is to carry out their job and their duties without political pressure from either party. So when you start allowing the president to come in and interfere with this work and pressure those agencies to carry out what they want it to do, it completely destroys the whole nonpartisan idea that these agencies are created to have. And Donald Trump has already actively been trying to do this, like him trying to get rid of Lisa Cook, the Federal Reserve governor, because she wouldn't lower interest rates. We're just going to keep seeing this happen more and more because it looks like the Supreme Court is just going to completely give him the green light to fire these commissioners. And it's like, at this point, what is the point of three branches of government? This man has way too much power in the executive. He ignores judicial rulings unless they are favorable to him. And now y'all are about to give him the power to influence independent agencies. Like, at what point does it stop and y'all step in and do something about this?
All right, family. So we got to talk about another big win coming straight from President Trump, courtesy of the conservative Supreme Court. And I'm going to tell you right now, and this one is heavy because this ain't just about some random legal technicality. This is about the core of presidential power. Like, who really runs the executive branch, right? Because the case we're talking about here is all about whether or not the president actually has the authority to fire people from these so-called independent agencies, as they like to call it. But they're supposed to fall under the executive branch. So now look, specifically, we're talking about President Trump firing Rebecca Kelly Slaughter, who was a commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission. And Trump did it without giving some special legal reason, right? Because under the law that governs the Federal Trade Commission, they say you can only remove commissioners for cause. Like they got to do something wrong. But Trump was like, nah, you out of here. And boom, she challenged it in court. Of course, as we know, for Democrats to do is to make speed bumps in the road, which I believe that I know the Democrats really can't stop Donald Trump. Only thing they could do is slow him down by putting speed bumps on the road. But he can basically do anything just about on what he's planning to do, which he was elected on in the first place. So what I'm getting to is Rebecca Kelly Slaughter challenged him in court, and some liberal judge decided to side with her, which means the case ended up being a fight between Trump and the liberal side, aka the Democrats, trying to block him from firing somebody that he put in power in the first place. And now the Supreme Court the conservative side of the Supreme Court is looking to overturn the liberal judge's ruling. And honestly, this has been happening over and over again. You know, the Democrats use one of their federal judges to stop Donald Trump. Donald Trump takes it to the Supreme Court. The conservative side of the Supreme Court, out of courtesy of the conservative side of the Supreme Court, things get overturned, and then Trump gets the green light to go ahead and do what he was going to do in the first place. That's what I mean by the speed bump. So it's just a whole rat race, and it's like a whole cycle, because these liberal justices, instead of interpreting the Constitution like they're supposed to, they are here playing activists in political games straight up, and they're pushing an agenda, and they not reading the law like it is. Now, I want you guys to see, in regards of the matter, this other clip and what was being expressed in liberal media and so forth.
I just finished watching arguments at the Supreme Court in a case involving the constitutionality of president's authority to fire executive branch bureaucrats. Now, Article 2 of the Constitution vests the president with the executive power and also the responsibility to execute the laws. When the president sees that the laws aren't being implemented consistent with what he deems appropriate, he should be able to fire them. And that's what the Constitution contemplates. There's a Supreme Court ruling from about 100 years ago called Humphrey's Executor. And Humphrey's Executor says that the president can't fire those employees, especially if they're part of certain multi-member lawmaking and law enforcement commissions that are sort of a hybrid. The Supreme Court appears dissatisfied with that, and it looks like there are 5, probably 6 justices who are ready to strike down Humphrey's Executor. It would be a good day for America and for the Constitution if they did that. Look forward to seeing how the court decides.
And there you have it, right? Because when you look at it with the conservative justices, they're basically stepping in and being like, nah, we're not going to let that slide. And the liberal media, they just in full cope mode, right? Because CNN, they're panicking. You can hear it in their voices because they know what's coming. They understand the gravity of this case. Because if the court sides with Trump, that means the president can fire people in these independent agencies that supposedly fall under his branch, which makes total sense, because if they work under the executive branch and the president is the head of the executive branch, why can't he fire them, right? So what he just said in the clip obviously is just common sense, but obviously we know that common sense nowadays isn't that common. And I want to show you guys this third clip in regards to the situation, and then we're going to head over to CNN.
Supreme Court weighing whether to expand the hearing on whether to dramatically expand the president's power. MS Now's legal affairs reporter Fallon Gallagher was in court. Fallon, I know you watched the justices argue this with the powers that be. So walk us through what you watched in the courtroom. Walk us through how this case is being argued and what stood out to you the most.
Yeah, Ariel, first of all, the biggest thing here is that the Supreme Court appears poised to overturn not only a 90-year precedent that shields these heads of these agencies, but also give President Trump expanded presidential power, giving him the authority to fire these agency heads. Now, this is a really big deal because the Supreme Court does not take overturning precedent very lightly. So a lot of the arguments talked about this precedent. It's something called Humphrey's Executor. It's a case that was decided in 1935, specifically involving the FTC, that shields those agency heads from the president firing them. Now, there was a lot of interesting argument and questioning from the justices. Something that stood out for me with Justice Roberts was that he said that the FTC as it exists today in 2025 looks very different than it did in 1935 in terms of its executive power and authority. But the liberal justices, those 3, Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson, had some really strong dissent. And I want you to listen very briefly to one of the things that Justice Sotomayor said.
You're asking us to destroy the structure of government and to take away from Congress its ability to protect its idea that the government is better structured with some agencies that are independent.
I think we're asking the court to return to the dominant line of authority that started in Ex parte Henin in 1839, when this court said that it's a settled and well understood construction of the Constitution that the president alone can remove executive officials.
So you can see that she has some really strong words there about the structural nature of the U.S. government and how big this decision might be in terms of changing the layout of the way things work here. But right now we are waiting. We expect a decision in this case by late June. Ariel?
Fallon, we know that conservative justices have in the past supported Trump's bid for expanded power. It seems like they're sort of following that playbook in how they're talking about this today.
Certainly, and this is the same Supreme Court who granted him that broad presidential authority in the immunity case. But they did tip their hand when they decided to hear oral arguments in this case. You'll remember that this came through the emergency docket. They decided to hear arguments on the merits. And when they decided to take up this case, they said that Rebecca Slaughter, the agency head at the center of this specific case, could remain fired while litigation continued. So signaling that, they kind of tipped their hand a little bit to show how they might be leaning between that and some of their lines of questioning today. I would not be surprised if the conservative justices side with the president on this one and grant him more authority. Ariel?
Well, there you have it. That is MS Now, formerly known as MSNBC. I like to call MSNDNC because we all know they have bias and they're basically pro-Democrat of a mainstream media platform. So now when you have someone like Brett Kavanaugh, right? And he's basically the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And, you know, he's a judge that just drew the line, right? In a way, because he's like, he came through with a real one, because he said, imagine this. The Democrats, they got the presidency, the House, the Senate, right? And they set up this independent agency while they in power. Then they go ahead and fill it up with all of their people, which is Democrats, all the folks that align with their agenda. But then they lose the election. Now they out of power. But the next president can't do nothing. So he's stuck with a whole agency full of opposition, such as the Democrats. People who not rocking with his plan, in this case, Trump plan. And that means they could literally block the president's agenda, which we know, while pretending to be neutral, talking about we are independent. And I always looked at people who were independent or independent voters. I feel like that's the easy way to, you know, take the cowardice role, because it's like, okay, you're independent, but then you can sit there and sway Democrat or sit there and sway Republican. But I feel as though if you stand for something, you have to pick a side and stand on something, and you can't straddle the fence. I look at most independent individuals who sit there and sound liberal but claim they're independent. I look at it as though they're just riding the fence and using the independent voter or the independent label to basically remix things to their liking, so they don't come off in regards to being what they really are and fully support of. Because if you have a liberal mindset but you call yourself independent, you're really a liberal, which means you're Democrat. But I just look at it as a way to not really stand for something, which means you'll fall for anything. But that's just my opinion. It's the easy route. Because look at Stephen A. Smith. Stephen A. Smith, we all know he's on First Take. He's a sports commentator, highly known for. Now he got his own podcast on YouTube, and he has this thing where he talks about politics and stuff like that. And I think his podcast name is The Straight Shooter with Stephen A. on YouTube. But he claims as an independent, but he speaks more of Democrat, and he voted for Kamala Harris, and he knowingly votes Democrat. So you're a Democrat, but don't sit there and try to defend Donald Trump because you're acting like you're Democrat. You're a Democratic voter, but you really have conservative values when it comes to your money and it comes to your investments and it comes to you building your wealth and the hard work you put in, which most conservatives are saying, look, you earn things through hard work. You reap what you sow based on the labor you put in, and you should have an opportunity to have access to more of your monies, of, if anything, all of it, and not be taxed to death, to be able to live the American dream and to get further and be successful. And the government should be involved in your life. But That's just my take on it. A lot of people take the easy route by saying they're independent because they don't really want to have a real conversation and really pick a side to stand on, so they can sit there and pick either side. And I think it's all just a way of not wanting to. It reminds me of a person that always wanted to be liked by everybody, but the ultimate understanding you come to over time as you get older is everybody won't like you, so you might just pick a damn side anyway. But anyway, I want to get to CNN because CNN, like I said, they are basically panicking in regards to the matter because they even admitted that the court is probably going to side with Trump because even they see how ridiculous it is to have people working in your administration that you can't fire. Like, yo, Trump put this woman in charge, so why can't he fire her? So just make that make sense. She got nominated for a second term by Biden and confirmed by the Senate. So yeah, that's why she's still in office now. But Trump's like, yo, you're not aligning up with what we got going on here. You're not moving in the direction we going. You got to go. And honestly, I don't see what the problem with that. If these agencies fall under the executive branch and the president is the head of that branch, then it's common sense that he should be able to decide who stays and goes because he's the one accountable to the people. But check out what CNN had to say.
Just how much authority President Trump has over independent federal agencies.
Right now, justices are hearing arguments in the closely watched case of a former Trump-appointed member of the Federal Trade Commission who was fired by President Trump after he said she didn't align with his agenda. I want to bring in CNN senior legal analyst Elie Honig right now. He's been listening closely to all these arguments. What have you heard so far, Elie?
Well, Wolf, it's going very well for the Trump administration so far. So the arguments are still ongoing, but the battle lines here have been drawn very clearly. The court's 6 conservative justices clearly seem to agree with the Trump administration's position that the president is the head of the executive branch and therefore can fire agency heads for any reason he wants. However, the 3 liberal justices strongly oppose that. They've been essentially arguing through their questions that Congress passed a law saying the president can only fire those agency heads for good cause, for poor performance on the job or other bad conduct. However, the numbers are the numbers here, and it seems the conservatives are making a strong case here that the president should have the power, notwithstanding a long-standing precedent that the president should have the power to choose to remove those agency heads from the FTC and other similar agencies, really for any reason he wants.
What will a decision, Elie, in this case say about the scope of the executive power?
Yeah, well, so there is a fundamental recalibration of executive power happening in this country right now. So the argument that the Trump administration's lawyer, the Solicitor General John Sauer, is making is essentially something that's been called for a long time the unitary executive theory, meaning the president is the duly elected head of the executive branch and he can do whatever he pleases within the executive branch, and it violates separation of powers for Congress to try to come in and limit that. Now, for a long time, Wolf, for decades, that's been a theory, but it hasn't really caught hold. Now, however, that you have the Trump administration in power, that you have 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court, this unitary executive theory is really reaching its pinnacle, and it is becoming the law of the land. And again, the liberals were pushing back. At one point, Justice Sotomayor said, don't we risk making the president a king? Essentially, she said, even kings cannot remove whoever they want for whatever reason they want. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and Justice Kagan voiced similar concerns about giving the president too much power. But the response from John Sauer, essentially, we're not saying the president can do whatever he wants throughout all of government. We are saying the president controls the executive branch and has complete power within that executive.
See, that's the hypocritical part because they're saying that Trump is basically considered as a king and we can't give Trump too much power. And that's the whole point of separation of powers. But the thing is, how are you giving someone so much power if they're appointed under a branch such as the executive branch, as he's appointed as president, and this is within his power? You can't sit there and say you give somebody too much power and it's within their power to be able to take action and appoint whoever within their own vicinity or entity in which they're appointed to. So it makes no sense. And what the thing is with this whole thing, 90-year-old theory that he just mentioned, the senior legal analyst right here on CNN. The problem is Trump is making law of the land, law of the land, where there's actual order, and instead of these general broad. That's the problem. It should have never been a theory, is my point. It should have been something set in stone, something that's law, because we all know that liberals, aka Democrats, like to look for loopholes that are basically incentives to push their agenda, and they incentivize each other by making sure they benefit off of it, and really it takes away from their action of actually operating for the best interest of the American people. So the question is, why is Ketanji Brown and in the Supreme Court, individuals like liberals pushing back so much? Is because they know they were able to use this 90-year-old theory and use Congress as a way of blocking things. And now they know that that's coming to an end, because the simple fact is you just so busy focused on stopping the president that you cannot nowhere near be totally focused on the American people. So they exposes themselves every single time. It's like when you turn the light on and you roaches scatter. They scatter out of anger, and they scatter out of fear, and they start fear mongering, talking this king shit when there's nothing king about it. And if he didn't care and wanted to just do what he wanted to do, he wouldn't be going through the legal proceedings to even take this to the Supreme Court in the first place, which again makes no sense to call him king or act like he's acting more within the entity in which he's appointed to, which is the executive branch. So there's no abuse of power or him having too much power, and there's no such thing as him going above and beyond his own role when it comes to separation of powers. He hasn't overstepped anything.
Branch.
Next month, Ellie, the U.S. Supreme Court will consider another case involving the president's firing of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. Is this case the same as that one we've just been talking about?
So good question. This has actually come up in the arguments today. It is clear that whatever the ruling is today with respect to the FTC will impact most of the other 24 or so independent agencies in the executive branch, the National Labor Relations Board, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and on and on. However, justices from both sides, including Justice Kavanaugh, have made a point of asking the Trump administration's lawyer, but isn't the Fed different? And the Trump administration's lawyer said, yes, it is. So the Fed seems to stand separate and apart from these other agencies. And while the Trump administration seems very likely to win this argument about the FTC, it's clear that the Fed is going to raise different issues and that the president may not have such broad power to remove Fed chairs.
When do you think we'll hear a ruling?
Well, ordinarily, we get the big important rulings from the Supreme Court at the very end of their term, which usually means May and into June. However, the Supreme Court expedited the briefing and oral argument in this case.
Yeah. So you heard all that. I mean, we don't even care about the Fed because we know Jerome Powell ain't going to be there for long anyway. He got like a year left. I think this is last year, because his term is about to be up. So what I'm saying is, when it comes to these independent agencies, they get appointed by Trump, the president, and you really think the president is putting someone in charge of a major federal agency who don't align with his goals? It's just common sense. That's not how politics work, and that's not how any of this works. And then there's the Federal Reserve that he just mentioned, and the Fed is like an untouchable entity, right? Nobody can touch the Fed. No real control, and they move how they want to move, which is weird, but the Supreme Court probably not going to mess with that either, because they seem not to. I don't know why nobody wants to challenge or are so afraid to challenge the Fed. But in the long run, it's not going to matter, like I said, because when it comes to Trump, Jerome Powell term is up soon, like early next year. And when that happens, Trump's is just going to appoint someone else anyway. So probably going to be Kevin Hassett, because he's on Trump economics team. So regardless of whether Lisa Cook can be fired or not, it's going to be worked out eventually. But in this case, it answers the bigger question, right? Who really holds the power in these agencies? And that is what matters. So yeah, it's a loss for the Democrats, but low key, this actually could benefit the Democrats if they ever get back in power. But the goal is they shouldn't and they should not be back in power. Because if the Supreme Court rules in Trump's favor, that means the next Democrat president can do the same thing. But again, that's why we cannot let Democrats win again and give them this kind of power, because they just weaponize it, and Trump only got 3 or 4 years max left, and he's trying to do as much as he can. So if that means challenging some of these so-called precedents and flipping the system back in favor of presidential authority, then that's exactly what he's doing. And the more he wins, the more power the executive branch become. But again, that's only good if the right people are in power. You let the Democrats get that kind of authority, they just gonna tear everything the hell up. So that's my thoughts on everything. And also, I don't know why people act so surprised with Donald Trump. He's a common sense guy, even with reporters and stuff. He basically matches the energy you give him, and he says it out loud all the time. So, you don't think he's not going to challenge to make sure these laws are actually being followed and upheld, and there's no theories or precedents taking place. So let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe, because we got a lot more of these coming. We got a lot more of these coming, these videos and stuff like that. So just stay tapped in. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.